Called Puritan Spring, I emphasized, as is the habit when you write a précis, the positive and powerful influences of the movement under consideration. And there is no doubt that the Puritans were at the vanguard of the foundation of colonies here in North America, that they insisted upon the beheading of Charles I in 1649, a seismic political event, and that one of their most famous representatives wrote Paradise Lost. But that kind of power, which typifies the Puritan spring, can only emerge after a long winter. We have one of our better gardeners in the congregation, and I think she will attest that the bulbs need to be there in the ground through the winter in order to emerge with their force come springtime. So today I want to begin with the winter of Puritanism, with the kind of repression that caused them to gather resources that, when they broke out, turned out to have a revolutionary impact. How revolutionary, I hope we'll see when we come to the end. I'll begin the story with the pamphlet that Henry VIII wrote in 1521, in which, as you can see on the handout within the first box, he defended the 7 sacraments against Martin Luther. Incidentally, in writing that, King Henry VIII was showing how aware he was of a major dimension of the Reformation. We were saying just last time that as you shifted into the construction of Christianity that Martin Luther insisted upon, the only ritual that truly mattered was faith itself. And therefore, there was certainly, within his understanding of Christianity, a reduction in the number of sacraments, but more importantly, a devaluation of sacrament itself as compared to the ritual importance of faith alone. Precisely as this occurred, there was a counter-reaction of which Henry VIII was part, insisting upon not only the sacraments, but on the sanctity of the hierarchy. Because he came to the defense not only of the sacraments, but of the papacy, Henry VIII was given the title by the Pope, Defender of the Faith. And whenever you see the British monarch now, she is introduced with that title, to my infinite amusement, and now I hope yours. The reason for which it is vital to understand is that at this same time, in Germany, the fortunes of the Reformation were very different. They did not have central government either for or against it. Central government was divided. Germany was sliding into a prolonged civil war, and as a result of that, it would take longer for Germany to arise as a nation-state than other countries in Europe. Rather than being able to take up a central identity, the Reformation in Europe identified itself by means of protest. Hence, for example, the protest against the Emperor Charles V at the Diet of Speyer that occurred in 1529. This is why we call the group Protestant, because of its insistence upon its rights over against central authority. This is one of the principal foundations of Puritanism. The idea that in the face of a hostile central government or a divided central government, we will discover differing principles on the basis of which we can assert our identity. But as Henry seemed to develop a favorable relationship with the papacy, and therefore seemed to be taking a pro-Roman Catholic and anti-Protestant line, events in his household would take him in a different direction, and events in the Vatican household would take the papacy in a different direction. Over the course of time, Henry and the new pope, now Clement VII, found themselves at loggerheads. Henry had married Catherine of Aragon, and as a result of that marriage, he had no surviving male children. This was bringing about, in his judgment, and in the judgment of many in England, a crisis. How could you possibly see your reign governed by a woman? You had to have a male heir. And Henry VIII decided that this situation was caused by the fact that he had married his brother's wife. His brother had died. He had married her. This was against the book of Leviticus, hence its divine punishment. And he called upon Clement VII to see to it that this marriage was annulled, so that he could proceed to another marriage with, I don't know, maybe Anne Boleyn. By the time this request came to Clement VII, there were good reasons for Clement to prevaricate, and he did. Because in 1527, Rome itself had been sacked by the Holy Roman Emperor. Yes, I'll say that again. Rome had been sacked by the Holy Roman Emperor, who thought he should be in charge of this, and he should also have the benefit of its wealth. After all, he was called the Holy Roman Emperor, while the Pope was, in effect, his chaplain. So now Clement is under the actual control of Charles V. Alas, alas, his aunt was Catherine of Aragon. What was he going to do? He sent a cardinal in the hope that sending a cardinal would bring about delay. We have reason to know that always works. He sent his cardinal. The cardinal convened a trial, and then when it appeared that the trial would result in the recommendation that the marriage be annulled, the cardinal decided, here we are in England in summer, the weather's too hot. So he called off the trial so that he could retreat to cool Italy, and no decision was made. Henry, meanwhile, found a way in which he could put pressure on the papacy. He did that through Parliament. And here come the Puritans beginning to exert the first signs of force. Because the Puritans believed that monarchy should be seen as limited in authority, that by its very nature, monarchy should be seen as restricted. Restricted by what? By most times, Puritans in England are looking to the development of Protestantism in Geneva under John Calvin. And under Calvin, the Reformation takes a fresh dimension. It is much more politically focused than under Martin Luther, for the simple reason that John Calvin was actually running a substantial city. Martin Luther never had that benefit or that burden, depending on how you look at it. In Calvin's understanding, there was no such thing as a king over the city. It was rather that individuals in the city, all of whom were united in their commitment to God, would also, as he would say, covenant with one another. And this covenant was the ultimate authority, politically speaking. not any kind of anointed individual from the outside. According to Calvinist theology, God's providence worked itself out by the way in which human beings responded in faith to God and to one another. Their mutual covenant was the ultimate authority, not some kind of higher up. And so Parliament began to pass laws in which they would say, you know, this system in which if a priest commits a crime, he can appeal to Rome and therefore get out of the civil courts, even when that crime is murder or rape. This is not a very good idea. And so we should pass a law, which were called the Praemunire laws, which would state with all clarity that priests in England were subject to the laws of England, because at the end of the day, as they put it, as far as the law of Christ allows, juries in England should make their own distinctions about guilt and innocence within their boundaries, and it was all fit together within a system that also recognized the authority of the king. This ultimately led to the concept that this trial that was going on about the annulment of the king's marriage, that should not be settled in Rome. That should be settled by the Archbishop of Canterbury along with his colleagues. Surprise, surprise, Thomas Cranmer, who himself would take a German wife and was fully a part of the Reformation, would find that the marriage should be annulled, and therefore Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn and was quickly excommunicated, along with everybody in England, on the grounds that they had failed to show obedience to the papacy. You understand that this is a very clear example of how, politically speaking, the battle over ritual, whether the principal ritual is faith, as the Puritans insist, or the principal ritual is obedience to the papacy and the sacraments, as the Roman Catholics insisted, came to a head. And in response to that, the papacy also authorized the formation of what was called the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. And the function of the Jesuits was, as they put it in their charter, to fight under the banner of God in our society so that they serve solely God and his vicar on earth. That would be the papacy. So that the Society of Jesus is actually formed as an instrument which moves along the lines that we described last time for how it was that Roman Catholicism was emerging out of medieval Christendom, just as Protestantism had emerged out of medieval Christendom, but with different systems, over this crucial question of what the central ritual truly is. Because the line was so clear, when England shifted from one side to the other, the results were drastic. So, after Henry's death, with the ascent of King Edward, Thomas Cranmer, who had studied in Germany after he'd studied in Cambridge, who had married, as I said earlier, would produce the Book of Common Prayer, would see to it that the Bible was translated into English, would revise canon law, would make sure that the worship of the church would be not in Latin, but rather in English, and would also arrange for the education of the clergy, perhaps the most radical act of all within the Reformation. But then came Queen Mary. Queen Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She was a devout Catholic. She would marry Philip II of Spain. Once again, Roman Catholicism was the religion of the land. Those that opposed it were heretics. That's why Thomas Cranmer was burnt at the stake, along with Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, two other bishops in the middle of Oxford, so that people could see clearly what was going on. This would be the result of all this Englishing of the liturgy and of the Bible, and this attempt to locate authority within the sovereign bounds of England. At this point, it appeared to be the case that you basically had a very solid phalanx of Catholic nations opposed to the Reformation. You had France, you had Spain, you had England. Germany was divided up. Switzerland was preeminently Protestant, but it was a series of city-states, not a country. The only place where you had substantial military power on behalf of the Reformation was in Scandinavia. And the strategy at this point, particularly of Philip II, was to make sure that military power would always be on the side of Roman Catholicism. And it appeared to be the case that he had the wherewithal to do it. For example, he had what was, by all accounts, the most powerful navy of the time. In 1571, at long last, Philip II defeated the Turkish Ottoman fleet in the Mediterranean. So it appeared to be the case that nothing whatever could stop him. When he determined, after the death of Mary, and Elizabeth I said, "No, I don't think I want to marry you," when he determined that he would attack the English, it appeared to be the case that this indeed would be the end. It would be finished once again as it had been when Mary came to power. See the importance of the difference between being the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Mary, and the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth. But she maintains that she's going to resist this invasion force, which, as I say, was part of a larger strategy. The Spanish Armada made its way through the English Channel, not only to deal with the English, but also to deal with the Dutch. These were the two most central expression of Puritan power at that time. And, to general astonishment, the Spanish Armada foundered in the English Channel in 1588. This was seen by Puritans in England as being a divine sign, as you can see over on page 4. Looking back on these events in 1609, Thomas Brightman cited the book of the Revelation of John. He saw the defeat of the Armada as literally being apocalyptic, as part of the final events in all history. So we cited Revelation 11:15. The seventh angel trumpeted, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever." Then Brightman actually identifies this trumpeting sound with the ascendancy of Queen Elizabeth, because, he wrote, "She gave herself and her kingdom to Christ by way of thankfulness, which she showed by rooting out the Romish superstitions." And this insistence on the removal of Rome's influence is seen as the very beginning of the apocalyptic drama. You remember back when we were talking about the medieval synthesis and Joachim of Fiore's thought, according to which some in the Franciscan order believe that the Pope was the Antichrist. And Martin Luther was very happy to use that language as well, for example, in his introduction to the book of the Revelation of John. Now the Puritans are using the language of Antichrist of Rome in order to stake out a view of world history according to which the power of the papacy was going to fall, and in its place would come the millennium of the saints, their 1,000-year rule. One of the reasons for the force of the Puritan spring was their belief that they were literally on this final wave of history which was pushing on towards its goal. And once it had got that far, the Puritans also insisted that the way in which England was run had to accord with their principles. Therefore, when a king acted in an appropriate way, in accordance with the Puritan covenant, they would praise that king. When the king failed to, they might respond by leaving England. So, for example, the group that we call the Pilgrims first went from the south of England and then to Amsterdam, another predominantly Protestant country. When they got to Amsterdam, they found toleration and decided they didn't really like it very much. And so, having experienced that in Amsterdam, they went to some place where there wasn't much toleration, and they founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, with the insistence that everyone there should follow the insistence of the covenant, should join with one another in the recognition of God and in their rights, one person as compared to another. As time went on, within England, a greater and greater rift developed between the monarchy and the Puritans until the English Civil War resulted. Charles I was beheaded in 1649. And at that time, the principal propagandist for Oliver Cromwell set out the reasons for which it was right and necessary for the king to be beheaded. The name of that propagandist was John Milton. That's the connection with Paradise Lost. Because Milton's day job was as a propagandist. Well, one reason that he was able to survive the Puritan Revolution and then the Restoration was the blindness that set in at the end of his life made him seem not dangerous to the restored monarchy. But at the time, he was the chief propagandist of this point of view. And it was within his defense of beheading the king in the same year it happened, in 1649, that he wrote his pamphlet called On the Tenure of Magistrates and Kings. And in that, he wrote, this, by the way, is some of my favorite prose of this period. No man who knows aught can be so stupid to deny that all men were naturally born free, being the image and resemblance of God himself, and were by privilege above all creatures born to command and not to obey, and that they lived so, till from the root of Adam's transgression, falling among themselves to do wrong and violence, and foreseeing that such courses must needs tend to destruction of them all, they agreed by common league to bind each other from mutual injury and jointly defend themselves against any that gave disturbance or opposition to such agreement. Hence came cities, towns, and commonwealths, And because no faith in all was found sufficiently binding, they saw it needful to ordain some authority that might restrain by force and punishment what was violated against peace and common right. This authority and power of self-defense and preservation, being originally and naturally in every one of them, and unitedly in them all, for ease, for order, and lest each man should be his own partial judge, they communicated and derived either to one, whom for the eminence of his wisdom and integrity they chose above the rest, or to more than one whom they thought of equal deserving. This first was called a king, the other magistrates. That is, John Milton sets out the classic Puritan understanding of how it is that government rightly works. It works by means of covenant with God among human beings. And anything that sets itself in opposition to that, because it claims to derive outside of that covenant, is to be destroyed, because it obscures the extent to which every human being is made in the image and the likeness of God. I always enjoy teaching this text to students and asking them to identify who said this. And reading it over, they will sometimes say, "Oh, I know, Jean-Jacques Rousseau." And I say, "No, it's too well written." Or they might say, "John Locke." And I say, "Better guess." But the sentences would be longer if it was Locke. And in this regard, both Rousseau and Locke were actually cribbing from John Milton. The conception of an inherent human right that cannot be taken away by any authority derives from the Puritans and from no one else. I know they're the group we love to hate. I know we think they're the guys that just wouldn't wear buckles and loved blue laws, but they only passed those regulations as they saw it as part of the covenant. And while they were doing that, they argued the very principle of the modern age, that there is such a thing as an indestructible human right. The result of that, we're going to see next spring. Thank you very much indeed. I got to say, I think that John Milton might have a future as a writer. Thank you. Yes, please. Bob. Yes, that's right. The Gettysburg Address, although its most immediate roots are clearly to be found in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, those documents in turn were rooted in the conception of the Puritan covenant. Among the collaborators on the Constitution, the one who understood this most plainly was John Adams, who saw the influence, as you might expect a New Englander to see, of, for example, the Mayflower Compact on the way in which governance was seen by the time that the Declaration of Independence came along. Of course, by Lincoln's time, you had those documents in English. You also had Rousseau translated into English, and John Locke. He was aware of all of those, but he was also a reader of Puritans, including of John Milton. Yeah. So I would say that one reason for which, when Lincoln insisted upon that in the Gettysburg Address and elsewhere, and when Lincoln insisted upon the integrity of the Union, he did so with religious force. I'd suggest that, I know that we're supposed to believe in separation of church and state, because we're in polite company here. But, as it turns out, most religions and most times are not completely separate from state, and most states in most times are not completely separate from religion. There is a negotiation of values that actually manages to participate in those two, in cultures which are run with a degree of energy and integrity. If you look at those of our leaders in American history whom we regard as the most important, you will see that for the most part they succeeded in tapping into all the motivations of value of the people at a given time, and that includes religious motivations. That's why during the Civil War, the troops used to greet Abraham Lincoln by calling him Father Abraham. You know, they were seeing him as leading them on the equivalent of a long pilgrimage, which, in a profound sense, he truly did. If one were to look at the political situation at the time of the War of Secession in purely political terms, one might well say, well, you know, if South Carolina wants to go, take New Jersey while you're at it. You know, why don't we just divide up? Unless you believe that actually there was a fundamentally important dimension of union which would be totally expunged if you permitted that to happen. That clearly was Lincoln's conviction, and I would say that it went well beyond political calculation. Yes, please.
Your example of South Carolina made me also think of the split within the American Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion. Can you tie any of that in with what you've been saying?
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Question arises because we're dealing with the issue of secession. What about within the Anglican Communion itself? We have a certain amount of disagreement going on at the moment because within the laws in the United States, there are churches of the Episcopal Church where same-sex marriage has been performed. This is one of those churches. The chapel is another of those churches. We in the Episcopal Church would say, and have said, where it is legal in the United States and where we understand the intention of the couple to be towards lifetime union and support and the maintenance of such a relationship that the grace of Christ is commended, we should go ahead and bless that union. This causes some elsewhere in the Anglican Church enormous distress. There's no question about that, and we have acknowledged their distress, and we in the United States have not attempted to say, you must do this in order to be a Christian. But we do see this as part of our prophetic vocation where we are. But that's not the only issue. You know, there's always been one of these ever since I've been involved in the ordination process, from the time that Fred Cartier was interviewing me and unwisely giving me my first job in the church. All of those who wonder who did this, and if Fred Cartier did this. If he hadn't done that, I might have done something else. Ever since that time, we were arguing about the ordination of women in the Episcopal Church. Then in the United States, we went ahead, and elsewhere, chiefly the Church of England, the decision was made, maybe we shouldn't accept the ministry of any American Episcopalian. I know that because that's just when I went to England. I was principally studying at Cambridge University, but I was just making the transition from deacon to priest at this time. And the ordaining bishop wanted to know, do you support the ordination of women? I said yes, and I wrote my first article in defense of it. He ordained me anyway. Eventually, the Church of England said, well, yes, I suppose you could ordain a woman. And then they said, but you couldn't make one a bishop, now could you? So that's, you know, so at that stage, the position is so beat up, is so attenuated by compromise, that it becomes clear that within the Anglican communion, what we have is genuinely a communion. What we do together is worship and share Eucharist. We actually cannot determine one another's social policies because they are extraordinarily different. To give another example, yes, you could argue that the Church of Nigeria has an awful problem figuring out why we should be celebrating same-sex unions. On the other hand, no one asked the Episcopal Church in the United States to approve the practice in the Church of Nigeria that permits polygamy. And it does. That is, if you have had, I'm assuming you're a male at the moment, if you have had several wives and you decide you want to be baptized, that's good. We'll baptize you and we'll baptize your wives, and you'll be one big happy family, or families, depending on how you look at it. And if one of them should die, you're allowed to marry up to the number of wives you came in with. I call this the grandmother clause. Now, I am not saying, because I'm not there, I am not saying the Church of Nigeria must stop this practice, because the last time I looked, Jesus' teaching on marriage was one man and one woman when he gave that example, right? Just the verse which is used by opponents of same-sex marriage. I understand that cultural situations cause you to apply interpretations in fresh way. But because I understand that, I don't believe that a communion of churches gives any one of those churches the right to legislate for another. And that, to my mind, is exactly what we're arguing about within the Anglican communion at this moment. Yes, please, Bob.
Two things. One, follows what you're saying. How come there is a Queen Mary and a Queen Elizabeth if Henry VIII had to marry somebody else to have a boy?
Well, you know, it took a lot. You know, he ran through Catherine and Anne, and you know, and finally he got Edward. But he got Edward late, and Edward was very sickly, and Edward died. And so within the dynastic succession, they had at that stage to take the step of permitting a woman to ascend to the throne, first Mary and then Elizabeth. One of the reasons for which there was an enormous feeling of divine vindication when the Armada was sunk was that here was a Protestant woman on the throne who had refused marriage with Philip II, the Catholic monarch, who faced up to an obviously superior force and who won nonetheless. The feeling was that Providence had to be on the side of the English for that to take place.
Can I one more? Where did the Protestants, or Reformation, get its idea of what I think we would call democracy in terms of relationship of people to people from? Did they get it from Christianity, from the Hebrew Bible?
Mm-hmm. I think the exact moment comes when John Milton refers to authority in the human being, as he says, born to command and not to obey. Why? Because man, I'm going to use his language, because man is in image and resemblance of God himself. So he's thinking back to the book of Genesis. So he's saying the principle, the primordial principle of creation is that humanity is made in the image and the likeness of God. And that is something that belongs to humanity, again, as he puts it, unitedly. Everyone has that, individually and collectively. And therefore, the only way that they can justly govern themselves, and by justly he means within their relationship to God, is by means of forming a covenant or commonwealth with one another. That's the way he conceives it. It does not result in an instant recourse to democracy. It does result in a different understanding of what authority is. Because as far as Milton is concerned, the way in which power will be exerted will still be through what he calls magistrates, judges. Cromwell will establish himself as protector of the Commonwealth. You know, this Commonwealth language is not incidental. It's why Massachusetts is called a Commonwealth. Why Virginia is called a Commonwealth, I have no idea. The Anglicans made that, but they may just have made a mistake in their lexicon. I don't know. But in this case, the understanding is that the authorities around us can be shaped in such a way that they reflect the will of God. But that doesn't mean that we will instantly attempt universal suffrage. What's going on is that this idea, once planted, is going to move in a democratic direction through the modern age. And every time suffrage is extended, there's a controversy. All right, I can accept the notion that judges should be free to judge, right? This principle that Parliament establishes. But how do we get people in Parliament? Should we appoint them by, like the king or the magistrate? No, let's elect them. Okay, we will let men who own property and can read vote for someone to go to Parliament. Okay. Can we move from men who own property to men who don't own property? Difficult move. Can we go to women? Even more difficult. Can we cross races? None of these barriers appears at the time to be obvious. It will look that way once you're all done. We'll look back and we'll say, well, how could they be squabbling about that? And the answer is because you have to look at each of these apparently natural divisions and decide that it is overcome by some deeper principle. You have to know what that principle is. Milton is identifying the principle clearly before it's been worked out. But from that time, it would be worked out with increasing insistence. Yes, please, Louisa, then Trevor.
You mentioned Paradise Lost, and I was wondering what the reaction to that work was and what its influence was on people at the time. Was it even widely read or things like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent question. The influence of Paradise Lost, given that the people who originally read it knew where it was coming from. That is, he, by the time the work was published, was apparently on the losing side of history because of the Restoration. But the Restoration of Charles II didn't last all that long. The attempt by the British simply to restore the monarchy, to say the attempt of the Puritan protectorate didn't work, that itself fell apart and led later in the 17th century, in 1688, to what's usually called the Glorious Revolution. Glorious because they won that one. And the Glorious Revolution removed that royal house entirely from power and brought in a royal family from the Netherlands. So, that's safe. And it's from that time also that you have an explicit understanding of constitutional monarchy. What is constitutional monarchy? This is a Puritan concept. It's saying kings are great, they have limits. They can only act within certain parameters. And from 1688, 1689, that is the case in England. And that's how democracy, in its particular form in that country, has emerged over the course of time. Milton's work was being received during exactly this period. And therefore, your reaction to it would largely depend on your own political orientation. Meanwhile, it has a certain literary quality. It is magnificent writing. And it also does for English literature what Dante did for Italian letters in offering a theological vision grounded in the Bible. And therefore, ultimately, Milton overcame his own bad press as a result of his political career prior to his repute as a poet. Trevor?
It might be slightly off topic, but if there are religions that permit polygamy, many wives, are there any religions that permit many husbands?
Yeah, here, Trevor is asking for fair play. You know, if you can have polygyny, if you can have many wives, why can't you have polyandry, that is, many husbands? And there are cases where that does occur. However, and this I must say I find interesting anthropologically, it does appear to be the case that what we typically refer to as patriarchal culture is something that emerged at the time of the Stone Age, when you also had kings establishing standing armies. If kings establish armies, they largely tend to do it out of the ranks of adolescent men. Why? Only adolescent men will do that. Whatever they're told, at whatever level of violence. Now, when you send them to war, and if you're a city-state, you send them to war. If you're a city-state, you're constantly in a state of war. Why? City-states can only exist if they can produce beyond subsistence. In the Stone Age, this is not an obvious proposition. You know, there's no genetic mutation. There's no Monsanto. There's no plow. So you need slave labor, and you need an army to extend your lands. You always want to be increasing your lands, and above all, you've got to protect your land. You cannot survive as king unless you do that. When you send your young male army into the field, one or two things is going to happen. They're going to lose or they're going to win. Win or lose, you have more women than men. Either you've killed enough of the opposition that their women become yours, or you die and your women are left without male counterparts. So I would say that the city-state in the Neolithic period is actually, for economic reasons, the source of what we call patriarchy. It doesn't start with some dream of male supremacy. It starts with socioeconomic conditions that result in myths reflecting this notion of male privilege. Look at that, there's a wasp in an Episcopalian church. Huh. Yes, please, Eve.
To go back to John, what were the monasteries doing at that time?
Excellent question. The question was, what were the monasteries doing at this time? When Henry VIII decides that he's going to go with the Reformation to the extent that justice will happen inside the borders of England, he also decides, what is this business of the Vatican owning property inside England? That's not appropriate. I know what I will do. I will nationalize the monasteries. And he did. He actually put the monasteries under royal control, and in many cases simply handed them to those of his supporters among the aristocracy. This is the root of the process today called secularization. He literally secularized the monasteries by removing them from Vatican control. Understand that during this period, many of those who were in monasteries understood themselves to have been required to be there. That is, children at this time were handed over to monasteries from a very young age, and you didn't have a monastic vocation necessarily. You were simply given to the monastery because your family couldn't support you at home. That was why many in monasteries, especially women, married at this time. Martin Luther married a former nun. And the reason for that was that she didn't see that she had a vocation to celibacy. She thought she had a vocation to marriage.
What about the finances? I mean, there was a lot of money, I think, in the monastery.
That's right. Therefore, Henry VIII was able vastly to increase the wealth of the monarchy. And many of the lands which are currently owned by the royal family were previously monastic lands. That's exactly so. Yep. Yes, please.
I was wondering about the influence of John Bunyan and Pilgrim's Progress was read about at the time, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John Bunyan in Pilgrim's Progress gives you a picture of the way in which each individual, being understood, as Milton would say, as in the image and resemblance of God, can be seen as on his or her way towards heaven. And so in Bunyan's case, all of this is being written up at an individual scale. One reason for that is that you already had everyman plays during the Middle Ages, in which every man is seen as being buffeted about by the forces of hell and of purgatory and of heaven. And Bunyan in Pilgrim's Progress wants to write this as being a coherent development, psychologically, of each individual, and reflects the way in which, within the Puritan sensibility, the chief drama that goes on in all history is the drama of the individual. The individual is sorting out these forces and is either triumphing over them or is falling victim to them, so that the individual human being acquires a value in Puritan thought truly unlike what had been the case earlier on. Well, the Cardinal just gave me the signal. That means that we're closing down for this particular semester, but we'll be back next semester. See you during Lent.